There was a moment, maybe when you were 7 or 8 years old, when you wanted to climb that tree in the backyard. You remember it clearly. The bark rough under your fingers, the branches close enough to reach, the whole world feeling like it was about to open up from somewhere higher than you had ever stood before. And then a voice called out, not angry, not cruel, just worried. Come down, sweetheart. You might fall. So you came down, and you told yourself it was fine, that you didn't really want to climb it anyway, that it was probably too high, too dangerous, that the view from the ground was good enough. But somewhere inside you, very quietly, something folded itself up and tucked itself away. Not gone, just waiting. Because that is how it begins. Not with a single dramatic event, not with cruelty or absence. It begins with love that holds on just a little too tight, for just a little too long, and it leaves a mark so subtle you almost don't notice it, until one day you do. You are the kind of person who hesitates before making a decision that should be simple, the kind who sends a text and then rereads it 4 times, wondering if you said something wrong. You apologize when someone bumps into you. You minimize your own needs before anyone else even has a chance to react to them. When someone asks what you want for dinner, there is a half-second pause before you answer, and in that pause you are doing the math. What do they want? What will they accept? What is the least disruptive version of my preference? You call it being easygoing. You call it not being difficult. But the truth lives a little deeper than that, doesn't it? You second guess your own judgment in situations where the evidence clearly supports you. You feel a strange guilt when things go well, like you somehow took more than your fair share of good fortune. You shrink in rooms where you should belong. You stay quiet when you have something worth saying. And when someone trusts you with a hard task, something small in your chest tightens. Not because you can't do it, but because the possibility of failing feels like evidence of something much larger than the task itself. How did you get here? The answer is older than you think. Somewhere around the age of 3 or 4, a child begins to develop something psychologists call a sense of self-efficacy. It is not a term that needs a dictionary. You already know what it feels like. It is the feeling of, I tried something hard and I did it. It is the moment a child skins their knee and gets back up. Not because no one cared, but because they were allowed to fall in the first place. Self-efficacy is not built through success. It is built through the experience of struggling with something and coming out the other side changed. Now imagine that every time you moved toward that struggle, a hand gently pulled you back. Not because you were incapable, but because someone who loved you could not tolerate the idea of watching you hurt. The intention was protection. The effect was something else entirely. The effect was a message that your nervous system absorbed before your mind had the language for it. The world is more dangerous than you can handle, and you are not quite capable enough to navigate it alone. Psychologists have a name for the parenting style that produces this experience. They call it overprotective parenting, and in more extreme cases, helicopter parenting. But the clinical label matters less than what it felt like on the inside. What it felt like was being loved and doubted at the same time, being cherished and quietly, unintentionally undermined. Because every time someone solves a problem for you, before you get the chance to solve it yourself, the unspoken message is that they weren't sure you could. Take a breath here, because this part is important, and it deserves to be heard slowly. Your parents, or the adults who raised you, were not villains. Most of them were doing the most human thing imaginable, trying to keep something they loved from being damaged. Some of them had experienced real loss. Some of them grew up in environments where danger was not a metaphor. Some of them simply loved you so much that the thought of your pain was unbearable. Love is not the problem. the wiring it creates sometimes is. Because here's the thing about growing up in a bubble, and this is the part that gets overlooked in almost every conversation about overprotective childhoods. The bubble wasn't empty. Inside it, there was warmth and safety and someone who showed up. So when you eventually stepped outside of it, you didn't just feel unprepared. You felt like something had been taken from you. You felt homesick for a place you couldn't go back to. And you felt vaguely, confusingly ashamed of that homesickness. Because the world kept telling you that you had nothing to complain about. You were loved. You were safe. What more could you want? What you wanted was permission to be competent. What you needed was to be allowed to fail. This is where the consequences begin to root themselves in ways that are not always visible from the surface. Because the adult version of an overprotected child doesn't look like someone who is harmed. They look like someone who is careful, responsible, thoughtful, maybe a little anxious. They look from the outside like they have it together. But on the inside, something runs on a much older operating system. In relationships, this shows up as a constant, low-grade need for reassurance that feels embarrassing to admit. Not because you are insecure in a shallow way, but because your nervous system was trained to look outside itself for confirmation that things were okay. When your parents made every decision, when they pre-solved every problem, you never fully develop the internal voice that says, I can trust my own read of this situation. So now, in your adult relationships, you look to other people to provide the certainty that voice was supposed to give you. You need your partner to confirm that the plan is fine. You need your boss to tell you the work is good before you feel settled. You need the silence at the end of a difficult conversation to be broken by someone else first, because sitting with ambiguity feels something like danger. Sometimes I don't know what I actually want. I just know what I think I'm supposed to want. In work, the pattern looks different, but comes from the same root. You may be excellent at executing tasks, but terrified of initiating them. You can do the work, but proposing the idea, owning the direction, being the one who said, this is what we should do, that feels like standing at the edge of something very high with no guarantee of what's below. Perfectionism sometimes lives here too, not as ambition, but as a kind of armor. If the work is perfect, no one can say you were wrong to try. If you never try, no one can confirm what you most fear, that you are not quite enough on your own. And then there is the relationship with your own body and its signals. Many people who grew up overprotected describe a strange disconnection from their own instincts, a difficulty knowing whether what they feel is their genuine response or an echo of someone else's expectations. When someone asks if you are okay, there is often a flicker before the answer comes, not because you are hiding something, but because you genuinely have to search for it. The habit of checking in with others before checking in with yourself runs very deep. Pause here, just for a moment. Notice if anything in the last few paragraphs sat somewhere in your chest, rather than just passing through your mind. Now here is the angle that almost no one talks about, and it is the one that tends to land hardest. The overprotected child doesn't only struggle with doing things, they struggle with wanting things, because desire is a form of risk. To want something is to open yourself to the possibility of not getting it, and not getting it in a childhood where disappointment was regularly intercepted before it could fully land, never got metabolized properly. You never quite learned to survive wanting something and not receiving it. So over time, wanting itself started to feel dangerous. And slowly, quietly, you learned to need less, to ask for less, to expect less, not as a spiritual discipline, as a survival strategy. I stopped wanting things that felt too big. It was easier than being disappointed. There is a psychological concept called learned helplessness, first described by Martin Seligman in the late 1960s, and it traditionally refers to people who have experienced repeated, inescapable failures and subsequently stopped trying. But there is a quieter version of this that lives in overprotected childhoods. It is not helplessness born of failure. It is helplessness born of never being allowed to try. The result looks similar. A person who hesitates, who defers, who says, "I don't know," more often than their intelligence would suggest, not because they lack ability, but because the muscle of autonomous action was never allowed to develop its full strength. And this is the painful paradox at the center of all of it. What kept you safe then is exactly what keeps you small now. The very love that shielded you is the love you have to, in some tender and careful way, learn to set down. That sentence is worth reading twice. The love that shielded you is the love you have to learn to set down. Not abandon, not resent, not erase. Set down. Because you cannot carry into adulthood a protection that was built for childhood and expect it to serve you the same way. A coat that fits a 7-year-old will not fit a 30-year-old. The coat was real, the warmth was real, but you have grown and the coat no longer fits, and wearing it anyway doesn't keep you warm anymore. It only keeps you small. Here is where the turn happens. Not a dramatic one, not a sudden awakening, just a quiet shift in the way you hold the story. For most of your life, this pattern happened to you. It was laid down before you had a choice in it, written into your nervous system before you had the words to question it. That is true. And it is worth sitting with, because dismissing that truth in the name of moving forward is not strength. It is avoidance dressed up as strength. You were shaped by something you did not choose. That deserves acknowledgement, not just 5 minutes of it and then a list of action items. But here is what is also true. You are reading this or hearing this, which means you are already doing something the child you were never got to do. You are looking at the pattern. You are naming it. And there is enormous power in that. Not the loud kind of power, but the quiet, foundational kind. The kind that changes things slowly and permanently. The work that comes next is not about undoing what was done. You cannot go back and retroactively fall out of that tree and skin your knee and learn that falling doesn't kill you. But you can, as an adult, begin creating those experiences in small and deliberate ways. Psychologists and researchers working in the space of adult development call this reparative experience, the practice of consciously choosing exposures that teach your nervous system something new, not through force, not through dramatic confrontation, but through repetition of evidence. I tried this. I was uncertain. I didn't fall apart. I'm not starting over. I'm starting from a new place. This might look like making a small decision without consulting anyone, like ordering what you actually want for dinner instead of what seems least complicated, like sending the message without rereading it 6 times, like saying "I don't agree with that" in a conversation where it would have been easier to stay quiet. These are not small acts. They are acts of reparenting yourself, which is a term that can sound either profound or slightly ridiculous depending on the day, but what it means is simply this: giving yourself the experiences your childhood didn't, not in a desperate way, in a gentle, patient, experimental way. Inner child work, which sometimes gets dismissed as soft or sentimental, is actually grounded in solid developmental psychology. The premise is not that you should regress or become helpless, but that the part of you which learned to need less, to ask less, to trust yourself less, that part is still there, and it is still young, and it still sometimes runs the show. Noticing when it is running the show is not weakness. It is one of the more precise forms of self-awareness a person can develop. Some days, this work looks like catching yourself mid-apology for something that wasn't your fault and pausing to ask, wait, why am I apologizing? Some days, it looks like sitting with a feeling of discomfort without immediately reaching for reassurance and discovering that you can, in fact, tolerate it. Some days, it looks like doing something imperfectly on purpose and noticing that the world doesn't end. These are not cures. They are not finish lines. They are data points. And every data point that contradicts the old story is a small brick in a new foundation. I'm allowed to not know yet. That's not the same as failing. The relationship piece of this deserves its own space, because it is often where the old patterns show up most painfully. If you grew up being loved in a way that came with an undercurrent of, we don't quite trust you to handle things, there is a real possibility that you have unconsciously sought out relationships that replicate that dynamic, not because you enjoy it, but because it is familiar. Familiar and safe are not the same thing, but to a nervous system, they can feel identical. This doesn't mean every difficult relationship is a reenactment of childhood, but it does mean that if you notice a pattern of being in relationships where your judgment is regularly overridden, where someone consistently knows better, where you feel grateful to be needed but quietly suffocated by the terms, it is worth asking where you first learned to accept that particular trade. You don't have to arrive at an answer right away. The question itself is useful. There is something else worth naming before we close, and it is this. Healing from an overprotected childhood is not a straightforward process, because unlike some other childhood wounds, this one does not come with obvious edges. There is no single moment you can point to and say, that is the thing that happened. It was ambient. It was 1,000 small moments of love that arrived with an invisible asterisk. And because it doesn't look like trauma in the conventional sense, you may have spent years telling yourself you don't deserve to be affected by it, that other people had it worse, that you should be grateful, that it's ungrateful, maybe even selfish, to examine the ways that love shaped you poorly. But here is something worth carrying forward into the rest of your day. The size of a wound is not determined by how dramatic its origin was. It is determined by what it changed in you. And if this kind of childhood changed the way you trust yourself, changed the way you inhabit your own desires, changed your relationship to risk and failure and belonging, then it is real, and it matters. And you are allowed to give it the attention it deserves. You are loved, and you are also, in some ways, quietly limited by that love. Both of those things are true. They do not cancel each other out. They exist together, and that is a hard thing to hold, but it is also the most honest thing. The process of coming into your own, at whatever age you find yourself now, is not about declaring independence from everyone who ever loved you. It is not about anger, though sometimes there is anger, and that is okay. It is about slowly, carefully reclaiming the parts of yourself that were never given the room to develop. The part that can make a decision and stand by it. The part that can fail at something and remain intact. The part that can want something big and beautiful and be willing to reach for it without waiting for someone else to confirm that it's okay to reach. That part of you was never destroyed. It was only ever waiting, folded up quietly, patient in a way that only something very young and very stubborn can be patient, waiting for you to come back to it with the understanding you didn't have then. You have it now. Maybe not all of it, but more than you did. And that is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. The tree in the backyard is still there. Not that specific tree, but the version of it that exists in every decision you haven't made yet, every desire you haven't let yourself speak aloud, every risk that stands between where you are and where you might be. You are not 7 anymore. You don't need permission to climb it. And if you fall, which you might, you now know something you didn't then. Falling is not the end of the story. It is often exactly where the real one begins.